Hello, I am Radagast at your service, and this is Mystic View number 13. And I am joined today by Joseph Butch Robins. I'm going to embarrass him and say a bluegrass legend. And did I embarrass you?
A bit.
Okay, good. And this interview or this conversation with Butch Robins is really about music, but we're going to be discussing bluegrass a little bit because it's relevant to why he is who he is, as far as an unknown legend is what I would say. And Butch, part of what we're doing here is both kind of reclaiming our musical souls. Would you say that?
That's a good way to say it, yeah.
And you have had some exposure in, I guess, in the bluegrass world, which for a lot of America is an invisible world.
Well, it's gaining ground. I mean, the demographics from the U.S. Census Bureau and everything are starting to show substantial gains. Such between a fourth and a third of the population has now been turned on to the music, and it's included in their musical repertoire out there, the things that they listen to. So that's been part of the reason that the IBMA has prospered so well, the International Bluegrass Music Association. So anyhow.
So Bill Monroe was, would you, one of the monsters of bluegrass? As
well,
far
he
as
started
presences?
it.
Okay.
I mean, it evolved around his career. So, as far as, and I'll talk about this, I've got a series of 6 videos at the McConnell Library at Radford University that folks can plug into and watch. And, the whole thing that was the phenomena of bluegrass sort of came about in a haphazard way. Bill Monroe was simply trying to establish a career in country music. He had landed himself in the cast of the Grand Ole Opry in 1939. And he had a series of musicians. He was a unique musician himself. He played and sang in keys that no other country musician of the day did in that period. He played to a bit of a different rhythm. It was more of a blues rhythm. It accentuated itself more on the backbeat than it did the beat of the traditional country music at that point. Mm-hmm. And there was some, from what I understand, there was some resentment around the Opry of him. The name bluegrass came about as a term applied to music as a way of separating him from the remainder of that Grand Ole Opry cast. Mm-hmm. He's here with us, but he's really not like us. He plays that old bluegrass music from up in the state of Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And when Earl Scruggs came in his band in 1945, all of a sudden this music had been sort of wild and playing just fast and frantic, and Monroe had this high voice that, chilled the young folks who were going to become the rock and rollers later on. I mean, when you read the interviews by Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis and Johnny Cash and all of those guys, they were heavily influenced by that singer on the Grand Ole Opry who didn't sing like a traditional country singer. Mm-hmm. He was loud. I mean, he sang higher than anybody else, and he sang with force and volume and power to his music. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the attracting fashion out there. The backside of Elvis's first record was Blue Moon, Kentucky, which was a rework of one of Bill Monroe's standards. So anyhow, he came along and the music got named, as much as I can understand it, by the actual MCs of the Grand Ole Opry. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that started. Here's Bill Monroe. Actually, they used to introduce him, Bill Monroe and Earl Scruggs with his fancy banjo, playing you some of that good old bluegrass music from up in Kentucky. And it became bluegrass music then. And that sort of distinguished it between the music that Roy Acuff and the Smoky Mountain Boys were playing, or Ernest Tubb, or the fruit jar drinkers, some of the older ones, that was there. So anyhow, it became a genre at that point. In my video series, I have a primal form of it which lasts from about 1945 until about 1958, when all country music was pretty much down the tubes because of rock and roll's impact on the Deep South. I have the music being reborn as an elevated art form in the early 60s with the inclusion of Bill Keith in the band, incidentally, who's a banjo player who changed the course of the music again. Mm-hmm. He was a melodic banjo player. He could play the fiddle tunes note for note. And it opened up a whole new world for banjo playing within Monroe's band. And the force of him as a musical entity, and the him being Bill Monroe, enabled a second career there that lasted from the mid-60s through the mid-90s.
So when did you join Bill Monroe?
I first joined in 1967, right about a week after I got out of high school. And I didn't last very long then. I didn't really care for him. And the whole conditions of the work out there. So I came back and went to school to try to dodge the draft. Didn't work. A couple of years later I got drafted. I wound up back with him in 1977, and at that point I stayed through. I went Labor Day weekend of 77 through the 4th of July weekend of 81, and then I came back to him in the 90s just as sort of a friend to be around him, and struck up the beginnings of an actual friendship I had with him. Before, I had been an employee, I had been a disciple, I had been a student, I'd been everything you can be, but when I came back in the 90s around him, it was more like being his friend. And that was, I think, when I learned the most about music from him. I learned how to play the tunes while I was working for him. But it was only after I achieved another level of relationship with him that I was actually able to learn about his music, what the core of his music was all about. So, anyhow, I hope I answered whatever question you asked me in that process.
Yes, and then that brings me to speaking about, I guess we're going to call it your recording career, or recordings you've made, let's put it that way.
I think my first record came out in 76. It was called 40 Years Late. I followed it with a very avant-garde sort of newgrass record at that time called Fragments of My Imagination. And then it wasn't long after I was working for Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper when I made that record, which is one of the more traditional of the country music acts on the Grand Ole Opry. So there wasn't a lot of emphasis put on this recording that I did, because I didn't have a band that played that kind of music and I wasn't involved in one. The last in the series that I made for Rounder was called The Fifth Child. And my father had cancer at that point, and I decided when they asked me for another record, I tried to do something in that traditional bluegrass form as good as I could, and I just happened to be working for Bill Monroe then. So that was my job, was being in that form, so it wasn't very hard to make that record. I just selected the material and went out and found musicians that I thought could help me execute it. So those were 3 solo records that I did back in the 70s that sort of established a place for me among banjo players. Then I was approached in the early 90s by a fellow after I'd been out of music for 10 years. And he wanted to do a package of records that could be sold on TV, like the old Boxcar Willie things through infomercials. So I made him a set of those, and I really hadn't been playing the banjo for the better part of 10 years at that point. Oh. So we had a young fellow booked in to do the sessions. I was just going to kind of be the musical director in the whole thing. And it turned out the young fellow got a job which took him to Europe for that entire summer. And I couldn't find any other banjo players that would be able to knock out the 40-some tunes we were going to have to do in 2 weekends of recording. So I got down my little metronome and taught myself how to play again. And I made that series of records, and it did good and enabled that fella to establish his own record label. Then I made a gospel series of records or recordings to do sort of the same thing. You know, it was 40 in the first package called Once Again from the Top. The second one was called Shine Hallelujah Shine, and I think it had 43 songs in it. And then not long after that, the fella that owned the record label got to hassling me. Back then, when I'd make my records that were band records, I just simply call them the Bluegrass Band. Joe Wilson used to be with the National Council for the Traditional Arts, used to chew me out every time I would show up because I didn't put my name in front of my band name. And I kept telling him that I thought the music was more important than me, and I didn't feel comfortable there. But they got after me to make a Butch Robins record, which was my banjo records. So, and I hadn't made one of those since the 70s. So I put together a recording, and it featured banjo playing in that bluegrass vein that I sort of knew about. At that point, I thought I knew about it really well. And wound up going in the studio with it, and after a day or two of confusion and running around in circles, Bill Monroe showed up and wound up helping me on half of the record, and it turned out to be really a good recording. So that's pretty much, and I did one other record when I put together the first Bluegrass Band in about 6 months after I quit Monroe. I think our first jobs were through the Christmas and New Year holidays down in Mississippi with that band. But I had made a record with them to use as part of our promotional material that we would send out. So that's another recording I made. But I think in total of all of those for the packages, they counted as 3 each. So if you count them all up, I think there's about 11 in there that I've done.
So I want to move from giving people an idea about where you come from, what your past is, to the present day. And because you and I do share some common, and we're both musicians, we share some commonalities in our philosophy about music. A lot of it having to do with genre is a place to get stuck. Where music is something from your soul, and souls don't really do genres. And you're with Global Mission of Peace, with part of our family, and your project is to bring this kind of music with the message, and largely I think the message has a lot to do with the Global Mission of Peace message of love for all, hatred for none, and embracing what endures.
When I first established the band, it's been about 8 years ago now, it was just simply, its mission statement was, its mission was to be a musical statement of international cooperation and goodwill. The big thing about the group is every member of the group is from a different nation.
Right.
And that's to show, and I try to make sure I've got as many different ideas, philosophies, religions, everything else. I try to get people from as diverse background as I can to get them together and put them in a pile for whatever time we travel together, and just, see how we get along. Sometimes it's a challenge, especially among musicians. You got guys who have, some folks that have higher opinions of themselves than others, and every once in a while that causes an issue or two.
It can get interesting.
But, I found when you put it in the context of where I'm at, the guys that, so far that I've been able to recruit in the thing to help out, have had an appreciation for the fellow man, don't care what his background is, just as long as he works on his music, That's the common denominator. That's the one reason I don't worry all that much is you know, the people who play in the bluegrass mode of today, and I consider today's bluegrass to be more a communication skill and a social skill than it is an art form, really. And it's a simple music. It really is. So what I'm able to bring to the table, I got my pick around the world of very, very competent musicians. They're all over the planet now. Hell, the last I heard, there was a full-time bluegrass band in Thailand, you know. So the musicians are out there. With me, it's getting these folks of different ideas and get them together and teaching us how to celebrate our differences and learn from them so we can enrich our lives just with our interaction of those who are different than us. So.
Well, you mentioned an album you made called 40 Years Late, and there's a song that you do called 40 Years Late.
Yes, sir.
And besides the fact that I think it's a great piece, I think it's an excellent example of how the banjo is not a bluegrass instrument. I mean, it's an instrument in bluegrass, but it's not locked in. And I think that song of yours really steps outside what most people would expect from for what a banjo should be doing, other than sounding like a banjo, which of course your banjo sounds like. I was just wondering if you would consider playing that song for us.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Then,
I would love to.
And then maybe after that, maybe I'll join you on something if you.
Yeah, man.
You know.
Now this came to me. I was 15 years old, and I'd gone to Galax, down to the Fiddlers Convention down here, and two old fiddle players showed me this real, what I consider to be a bizarre tuning. It's a C minor tuning. And I don't know what it was, but I was never able to learn from records. I could never slow down records and learn anything. I had to get something fixed in my head. Either that or I had to work it out for myself. And that's sort of the way this tune came about. It's actually, I can show you about a dozen old-timey tunes that are contained in it, that are in that minor thing. But back then I had an idea for banjo music and nobody else was doing it. And this is like mid-60s that this thing sort of came along for me. All right, here's 40 Years Late. you have it.
Well, thank you, Joseph.
You're quite welcome.
And any chance you and I do a little something together?
Sure. What you want to do?
Oh, play again, you.
Huh? Play again, then.
Butch is kind enough to be teaching me some of these songs, and I'm loving every minute of it, except for when I don't remember parts.
Well, that's often the way I am. All right, let me do something with this. Let me swap out banjos here. And now, this is was an instrumental that I had written, gosh, 7 or 8 or 6 years ago. And let's see if I can do it bare fingered. That's how we did it a while ago. And again, I was searching for other kinds of tunes or things on the banjo, and it happens to be in an oddball tuning for these days. This is a full C major tuning, but the ambassador actually inspired me to write the lyrics to this thing. Mm-hmm. When I was hearing, when I was first introduced to this about a year ago, he kept talking about his mission was to wake people up, out there. So I had this tune, and I'd written it just to be a rollicking banjo tune, and I thought that'd be, the words to that sort of came out of "Wake up now, sleepyhead, it's a brand new day." And being the singer that I'm not, we will try to do this. Now, for all the folks out there, there's one part that's got to be sung by a real low bass singer, and I don't have that voice. Really don't have that voice, so that'll be kind of rugged, but I'm going to do it anyhow. Are we ready, orchestra?
I do believe so.
A rock and roll hoochie coo. All right, here's Wake Up. 2, 3, 4. Then you might think again, within, without you, all about both enemy and friend. Every day God opens up a brand new page in your life's book. When evening comes, how will yours be filled in? With the spinning top, another lap around the sun we go. Hurry, scurry, faster, Mr. Huxley told us so. Blinded by our desire, we wander aimlessly below in mass communication, transportation, intoxication. Now open your eyes, a new day before us dawns. We can't go back. It's time now to move along. Neighbors, tell your neighbors, join the chorus. You can sing along, and we can end the strife and war and heal the earth and so much more. Wake up now, sleepyhead. Then you might think again, within, without you, all about both enemy and friend. A crumbling curtain's coming down, signaling the end. Another act, the final curtain, our question now, my friend. Or something.
Thank you, Butch.
With all the clams and all.
All right.
Clams and off-key singing. I'm good for both of those.
Wow.
But that's the way it is sometimes.
That's the way it is
when
sometimes.
we accept our humanness in this world and we quit trying to be perfect. Yes. And we quit trying harder and all those other foolish things that are ways that we drive ourselves insane.
Well, speaking about driving ourselves insane, we are going to, I know you have your Bluegrass project, but I know that also you and I have made some kind of plans to make some music together also.
Yes, sir.
And so, again, we're going to do that soul revival.
Yeah, and if folks out there listening haven't heard, we have another member of Global Mission, Wayne Heckler, who is a keyboard player who's joined in and does a great job, and he can really sing.
Yeah, he can.
He can really sing. He plays very well.
If we ever spend enough time together, maybe we could cobble together some 3-part harmonies.
Yes, sir.
I think we could do that.
As long as you keep me real low in the mix, we'll be all right.
So, you plan to do a re-release of that package that you had done. You spoke, I guess, with 42 songs on it. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Well, actually, we haven't figured out what we're going to do with them yet. I think repackage on the early ones because they're really good. But the one with Monroe in it, that recording was never exploited. So I don't know. It's some of the best work of the last 20 years of his life. So. In some of the compilation packages that are coming out there by Bear Family Records and everything, maybe someday they'll start picking up on some of the stuff he did outside the band. There were 2 or 3 records he had made there, and maybe that'll be part of that package someday. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to think that we at Global Mission of Peace will be able to create a little bit of a disturbance and a hubbub and reintroduce people to the work that you did before that is still as relevant today, because the musicianship does not change with the times. I mean, good musicians, good music.
I've always been conscious of that in my writing and everything else. I never wanted to be dated,
mm-hmm.
and that way, to try to avoid the musical cliches of the day, that are happening out there in any way, shape, form, or fashion, whether it be in rock and roll or country or bluegrass or anything else, but just avoid something that would be able to make the music be dated.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's the lyrical content of the songs or anything of that nature, that's what I'm looking for, is to avoid that if I possibly can.
I think we've kind of gotten to a point where everybody tries to make everything so perfect or so predictable, because of they're aiming at a market. They want a specific market. And I had a real shock a couple of nights ago. I'd read an article on, I think it was on Veterans Today, and at the end they had on the video I'd never heard by K.D. Lang. I think K.D. Lang has one of the most goosebump-inducing voices I've ever heard come out of a human being.
Marvelous talent.
So I figured, I haven't heard K.D. Lang. I'm ready for some K.D. Lang. I start the song, and I guess some producer got a hold of her. I couldn't recognize Katie Lang's voice, who is one of the more distinctive voices. She sounded like any of the other women singers I hear on the radio, including the kind of vocal tricks they're doing today. And I did not finish listening to a Katie Lang song because it didn't sound like Katie Lang. She had gotten Taco Bell'd. Yeah. She had gotten put into a tube and put into a taco shell and said, "Here's." You recognize the name, fine, but I don't recognize the artist.
That happened with Leon Russell after his induction into the Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. Somebody contracted him to make a recording, so he says, "Sure, that'd be something great to do." And Leon's been, he was producing Frank Sinatra and Aretha Franklin by the time he was 21 years old, and running the show in the studio. But they bring him in the studio, and for this record they're going to do on him, and don't even have him play keyboard. Mm-hmm. Just bring in the lyrics and sing, and did these elaborate. He told me that they spent literally millions of dollars on this recording, and I heard pieces of it, and it don't even sound like Leon. Don't sound like a Leon nor a Leon record. It's just really weird. When I was a young fella, following up on that thing I said with Carlton Haney a while ago, Carlton's on video. I've seen it on YouTube when he was honored by some bunch of country musicians down there, and he talked about the time he introduced me to Bill Monroe and got my first audition. And he tells the story. He says I was 18. I was actually 15 mm-hmm. when he introduced me to it. It was at the grand opening of the Melrose Shopping Center in Roanoke, Virginia. And the rest of his story goes, I remember bits and pieces of it the way he did, but my memory description is somewhat different. His description said when I started playing for Bill that I started playing a tune like Earl Scruggs, and said Bill just backed off and stopped me and said, I wouldn't play that like that. That sounds like Earl Scruggs playing. So I back off and I go something else, and I'm playing maybe like Don Reno, another famous banjo player that day. Bill says, I wouldn't play it like that. Okay, I back off again and I start playing maybe like Sonny Osborne or Don Stover or one of those guys out there. Every time I'd go into something like that, Bill would just stop, shake his head, I wouldn't do that. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, play it like yourself. So I said, how do I do that? And he said, well, the first thing you do is learn everything all those other guys did, and then don't do it. And that sounds like a typical Carlton story to me, and it sounds like Monroe's brutal honesty of how to get to the point of something. But I finally learned about that when I started teaching things. In my musical evolution, the greatest impact it was had on me outside of the musical realm is I picked up a book by a fellow named Hazrat Inayat Khan one time. And the opening of that book's, what is music? Music is nothing less than a picture of our beloved. And what is our beloved? That which was our source and is our destination. That shook me. I had never, music had always been a thing of numbers to me. So by the time I got finished with that guy's little book, and it was just a short book, it only contained 3 or 4 of his lectures. He passed on in 1924, and his words came through time and just struck me like nothing ever had. And I started understanding I never could sound like anybody else, even if I tried. So I guess I was sort of lucky that way. Because I got when I started teaching later on and started recognizing the problem of being a teacher, the biggest problem you have out there is evaluating your student. Because you don't want to throw information on the table that insults that student's intelligence. At the same time, you don't want to throw so much stuff out there you bury them before you get started, or having them start looking at things that are beyond what they're capable of understanding at that point. So I started dealing with youngsters who'd come up to me and they wanted to learn to play a banjo, and I'd ask them what they were into, and they'd say traditional music, which would mean probably Earl Scruggs at the basis of it. Or they're into the newer type of bluegrass banjo, or what people call bluegrass music now, and generally there's going to be Bela Fleck or Norm McKelney out there that they're looking at. So if they were an old-timey nut, I'd have them listen to Bela and Norm McKelney for 6 months. Or if they were into Norm and Bela, I'd have them listen to Earl for the first part of it. And then after that, I'd say, you can't listen to nobody anymore and have me teach you.
Mm.
You know, I've worked my entire life for a variety of reasons of trying to cultivate a relationship with a higher power that I could hold on to, knowing that higher power is in me, I'm in it, it's in me. And that whole relationship there, I did that my whole life. If I've got any talent, it's as a result of the blessing of that higher power. Yeah. As direct a connections I got. Why would I want another human being standing in between me and that connection?
That's beautiful.
And that's what I tried to impress on the students. You know, I used to go ask them, who's your favorite banjo player? Earl. Who's your favorite banjo player? J.D. Who's your favorite banjo player? Bela. Who's your favorite banjo player? Somebody else over there. And I'll say, okay, now that you're tired of bullshitting yourself, who's that one person? I mean, I'm looking at you and all of you are holding quite an investment in your lap out there. Who's that one person, if you were never able to hear them again, it would come closer to breaking your heart than any other? Tomorrow, take a look at him while you're brushing your teeth.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know, if you stood up to that mirror and saw Earl Scruggs' head sitting on your shoulder, it'd probably shock the hell out of you. But that's what it would take for you to sound like Earl.
Mm-hmm. Right. Very good.
You know, so that I believe that we ought to express ourselves. The challenge is what is ourself? Mm-hmm. Who is ourself? That's the big part of it. It's interesting here with your mystic view. I don't know what gets into mysticism and philosophy and vice versa. They've got kind of intermingling boundaries to me sometimes. But
well, you touched upon what I believe mysticism is. Mysticism, I believe, is a personal relationship with this higher power, and working to understand the relationship of myself to it, to the world, myself to the world, and just how it's all connected. Because my perception is any place where it seems like there isn't a continuity is a place where I have to fill in that continuity because it belongs there. There's something missing either in my view or whatever. There's a part of us that apprehends the universe at a more subtle level, and it doesn't quite require the same amount of detail. But it's not any richer in a certain data stream, but it's not a detailed data. It's kind of it's an alternative data stream.
that to me is where when I woke up one day and realized I had faith.
Mm-hmm.
That's waking up and knowing that everything's exactly like it ought to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that higher power out there. You know, there are times of uncertainty. We're certainly seeing times of uncertainty in global mission. We're still, in reality, we're sort of in one of them right now.
Mm-hmm.
But everything's exactly like it ought to be. Now, it may not be sitting right with me inside right now,
mm-hmm.
but my faith is what getting to that place you're talking about, and it's not really a surrender.
No.
It's just the fact that I don't need all the blocks filled in anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's all been taken care of. I've talked to Wayne before, I think, about illusions. I think we're all living in our own illusion. Our illusion is a composite of our life's situation and circumstance. It's what gives us our views. It's what gives us our opinions. It's what gives us our ideas. That's our illusion. Reality. All of a sudden those illusions start getting together. I think that's the only time we really glimpse reality, is when the illusions are coincidental.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah.
You know, we bring those illusions together and all of a sudden there's something that we do agree on fully. And if we get enough of us together agreeing on that, whether we're doing it with our mind, like what happens at the quantum level of things when our mind actually has an effect on the inanimate out there, the energy forms out there that manifest themselves as matter in front of us. Interesting stuff to think about, ain't it? Boy, I'm sure glad I met you. It opens up a whole arena for this, to talk about these things and just wonder out loud sometimes.
Yes. And I'm glad to have these kind of conversations. And I think maybe we should close our conversation with one more piece of music.
All right, well, I got that tune, Hambone, that I wrote. It's pretty simple, just a little...
Yeah, okay, I like that one.
All right. This one, for lack of a better name, was called Hambone. There you have it. And here's another tune we're going to do. And this one will be called Rural Retreat.
Thank you, Joseph. He did have his Michael Jackson hat, but the batteries didn't cooperate.
Technology has failed me again.
So we just can't do all that glitz. What would bluegrass be without its glitz?
That rural retreat exit just on the other side of Westfield, this tune was written on that entrance ramp southbound on the other side of that. I was broke down in a snowstorm down there once upon a time. All right, here's Rural Retreat. Thank you, Radagast.
Thank you, Joseph. Joseph Butch Robins on Mystic View. We'll be joining you in a minute outside. This is the end of Mystic View number 13 with Joseph Butch Robins. And I just wanted to, we're in Virginia now, at least I'm in Virginia. This is not Floyd, Virginia, where I'm living currently, but it's still the state of Virginia, and much of it looks like that. And this is a beautiful day for a cloudy day, but the rolling hills framed by the Blue Ridge Mountains over there is just eye candy. And I thought I'd like to share that as part of Mystic View 13. So I thank you all for joining us once more. I am Radagast. God bless you.